Watch how tensions explode in the House of Lords as Britain's economic future is thrown into serious doubt. This isn't just another political debate. This is about your bills, your job, your future. Peers are openly calling Rachel Reeves's plans disastrous, and the shockwaves are impossible to ignore. As confidence cracks and pressure builds, one question hangs in the air. Has the government lost control of the economy? Before we continue, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Britain Daily. It's completely free and it helps us keep bringing you the hard-hitting stories that matter. Let's watch this explosive clip.
My Lords, when the Chancellor of the Exchequer made her first speech in that office on the 8th of July 2024, she said that by growing the economy, the government could rebuild Britain and make every part of the country better off. My Lords, that was not a modest claim. It was the central economic wager of this government. Ministers told the country that the hard arithmetic of our public finances could be overcome by sustained growth across the Parliament, that higher productivity, higher investment, stronger real wages and the higher sustained growth in the G7 would produce abundance and avoid difficult choices. And that ambition is not wrong. Britain needs growth. We want the country to be more prosperous, more productive and more secure. However, growth is not summoned by slogans. It is not delivered by a press release, a reset, a mission board, a pillar, or another ministerial speech. Growth is earned by those who embrace risk and sustained effort to produce value. Government can, at best, help enable growth by making this country the best place in the developed world to invest, to hire, to build, to innovate and to make things. 2 years on, the question before this House is not whether the government's ambition was the right one, but whether their policies have matched that ambition. The answer, I am afraid, is clear. The government have borrowed too much, grown too little, and regulated to excess. The Office for Budget Responsibility tells us that successive plans to reduce borrowing and stabilise debt have, in its words, not yet materialised. Public sector net borrowing was £152 billion in 24-25 and is forecast at £132 billion this year. Underlying debt has continued to rise. Debt interest spending is forecast to rise from £110 billion in 25-26 to £137 billion by 2030-31. And while government debt is rising and borrowing costs are at a 30-year high, the government is spending £333 billion annually on welfare. My Lords, that is more than the government receives in income tax. That is the very definition of unsustainable. And when the government sought to cut the rate of increase in that spending, they U-turned. On Tuesday, the Prime Minister showed us how determined he can be in the face of unsustainable and soaring pressure. But when it came to the essential battle on welfare, the real test of his ability to get those tough and big calls right, the Prime Minister capitulated. And the government plans would merely have slowed the rate of growth, not reduced the bill. If we are to deliver the brighter future young people deserve, we need to be much more radical. So, can the noble Baroness, the Minister, say what measures in the King's speech will bring our unsustainable welfare bill under control? And can she say why welfare, which is so great a challenge, is not the subject of one of our debates this week? My Lords, those are not abstract numbers. Every pound spent servicing debt is a pound that cannot be spent on defence, roads, hospitals, skills or tax reductions. High debt interest is not a symbol of compassion, but the price of policy failure. At the same time, growth has disappointed. The IMF has cut its forecast for UK growth this year from 1.3% to 0.8%. The economy grew by just 0.1% in the final quarter of 2025. Youth unemployment is up. There are now more than 700,000 unemployed young people aged 16 to 24, and the youth unemployment rate has risen over the year. This is the reality behind the rhetoric. Ministers promised through their words a growth government, but they have produced through their actions a high borrowing, high tax, high regulation government. As the outgoing Minister for Safeguarding and Violence Against Women and Girls said on Tuesday, it is deeds, not words, that count. In the first session of this Parliament, the government's preferences were clear. When in doubt, tax. When in doubt, regulate. When in doubt, create a new body, a new duty, a new levy, or a new compliance burden. The rise in employer national insurance contributions was a direct tax on jobs. It was accompanied by a lower threshold at which employers became liable. At the same time, the government pressed ahead with higher wage costs and an Employment Rights Act, which, even after the important concession on day one unfair dismissal rights secured in this House, still makes it riskier and more expensive to take on staff. My Lords, employment rights matter, but so too do employment opportunities. If the government makes it more expensive to hire, more uncertain to manage a probation period, and more complex to comply with the law, it should not be surprised when firms hesitate before creating the next job. The people hit first are often the young, the inexperienced, the marginal applicant, and the small business that cannot absorb another legal risk. The same anti-growth instinct is visible in energy. The government has set out plans not to issue new licences to explore new oil and gas fields in the North Sea. At a time of geopolitical instability and high energy prices, it is extraordinary to choose greater dependence on imports over the responsible use of our own resources. It means less domestic investment, fewer high-skilled jobs, and more exposure to shocks beyond our control. So, my Lords, when we turn to the bills announced in the Gracious Speak, the official opposition will apply a simple growth test to each of them. Does it make it cheaper to hire? Does it make energy cheaper? Does it make it faster to build? Does it increase productivity? Does it make investment more attractive? And does it reduce the burden of regulation rather than merely relabel it? Where the answer is yes, we will be constructive and we will support the government. Where the answer is no, where a bill creates another regulator, another levy, another licensing regime, another statutory duty, another offence, another code, another reporting requirement, or another cost on business, we will challenge it firmly. And on the issue of productivity, I'd be grateful if ministers could provide more detail on the proposals to strengthen the productivity of the civil service. The country, my Lords, cannot afford another session in which every problem is met with a new rule and every industry is treated as a revenue stream. An alternative King's Speech would start with what the economy actually needs: lower business taxes, cheaper energy, faster planning, lighter regulation, and a serious commitment to competitiveness. It would slash business rates for the high street and for hospitality. It would remove the most damaging part of the Employment Rights Act. It would bring forward a serious deregulatory programme, not another request for regulators to write letters about growth. It would make energy policy serve industry and households, not ideology. And it would use our freedoms outside the European Union to strike a more agile, more pro-innovation path where that is in the national interest. So I ask the noble Baroness the Minister, which measure in the King's Speech will make it cheaper for a small firm to employ its next worker? Which will bring down the energy bill of a manufacturer? Which will cut the number of forms, approvals and licences faced by a growing business? And which will tell investors that Britain is open, not merely in rhetoric, but in law, tax and regulation? My Lords, let us turn to Europe. Like many noble lords, I listened to the Prime Minister's speech on Monday of this week, hoping that the government might have learned from the public's verdict in the local elections and changed course. I was disappointed. What we heard was not a reset. It was a retreat into the familiar instincts of the left. More state direction, more nationalisation, more guarantees announced from the centre, and closer alignment with the European Union. There is a place for government action, but the government cannot substitute itself for enterprise. It cannot nationalise its way to productivity. It cannot guarantee its way to opportunity if the private sector is being taxed, regulated and second-guessed at every turn. And it cannot align its way to competitiveness by binding Britain more closely to a European model whose own leaders now acknowledge is failing to deliver the growth Europe needs. My Lords, this is not an argument for hostility to Europe. Britain should trade with Europe, cooperate with Europe, stand with Europe on security, and work constructively with our neighbours wherever our interests coincide. But cooperation is not submission. Friendship is not rule-taking, and a reset must not become re-entry by stealth. The British people voted in 2016 to leave the European Union. At the last election, the Prime Minister promised not to rejoin the single market, the customs union, or free movement. Yet with every speech, every summit and every reset, the government appears to edge closer to the EU's regulatory orbit, closer to payments, closer to mobility schemes and closer to alignment for its own sake. And the irony is that Europe itself is now warning against the very model to which this Prime Minister seems so drawn. At Davos this year, the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, said that Germany and Europe had wasted incredible potential for growth. He said Europe had become the world champion of over-regulation. A few weeks later, at the European Industry Summit, Chancellor Merz went further. He said, over-regulation hampers our economic growth. He called for a regulatory clean slate and said that Europe must deregulate every sector. My lords, those are not the words of a British Eurosceptic caricaturing Brussels. They are the words of the Chancellor of Germany, speaking from the heart of the European project, warning that regulation has damaged growth, investment and innovation. The Draghi report made the same diagnosis. It said that Europe largely missed out on the digital revolution. It observed that only 4 of the world's top 50 technology companies are European. It warned that innovative companies are held back by inconsistent and restrictive regulations. My lords, if the leaders of the European Union now know that their penchant for over-regulation is a central cause of their economic weakness, why is Britain being drawn closer to that system? Why would we import the very burdens that Europe itself is trying to cut? Why would we trade the freedom to be faster, lighter and more agile for the comfort of alignment with a model that has underperformed? The Prime Minister owes the country a clear answer, not a slogan, not another platitude about being at the heart of Europe. Will the Minister confirm that there will be no dynamic alignment with EU rules without explicit parliamentary approval?
What you've just seen isn't just political theatre, it's a warning sign. When senior voices in the House of Lords start tearing into economic policy like this, it reflects something deeper. Growing fear about where the country is heading, rising debt, slowing growth, and pressure on ordinary families. These aren't abstract numbers, they're real struggles people feel every single day. And that's why moments like this matter. Because behind every speech, every accusation, every clash in Parliament, there are consequences for millions across the UK. The anger, the disbelief, the frustration, it's not just in Westminster, it's across the country. People want answers, accountability, and most importantly, results. Now the big question is, can this government turn things around, or are we heading toward even tougher times ahead? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think these warnings are justified, or is this just political point scoring? And before you go, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Britain Daily. It's completely free and it helps us keep bringing you the stories that truly matter.